Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. Great to be with you. And we are getting close to wrapping up our first season of Being Human. Many of you are longtime listeners from my old show, Managing Leadership Anxiety, but I'm so grateful for those of you who have joined in this first season. I've been thrilled with our guests. We've got just another episode after this, and then we'll take a little break, come back to you in August. Today's guest is Luke Norsworthy. I have really appreciated Luke for a number of years. He has a fantastic podcast called Norsworthy. He's been podcasting a long time. He has a whole slew of interesting people on there. Luke's also the pastor at Westover Hills Church in Austin, Texas. I've had the privilege of seeing Luke pastor up close and personal. He's a fantastic pastor, a deep thinker and a deep carer of people. And Luke's an author, and he recently came out with a book called How to Love the Life You Already Have, a guide to becoming the person life is demanding that you be. As I read the book, it was vintage Luke, playful, very funny in places, thoughtful, clear. Basically, Luke is trying to help us line up the life we have with the life we wish we had. And that means that one of the topics we got into was grief. Luke and I both have experienced grief in the last few years. And it just strikes me when you're a leader and when you're a public leader, maybe you're a pastor or you have some kind of a role where you have to get up in front of people on a regular basis. It just strikes me that when you are grieving, you don't get to put your life on hold. You don't get to pause your vocation and grieve. Grief just shows right up into your life, and it's a difficult thing to navigate. And I'm sure for many of you, that's been your story too. Maybe you've lost something precious to you. Maybe you've lost someone precious to you. And you've discovered that grief, it's like it has its own agenda. I kind of think of grief like a storm, like a weather pattern. Sometimes you can see it coming. Sometimes it just shows up. But either way, it doesn't knock on the door. It just comes right on in. And then it stays as long as it wants to stay. It's like you don't have much control over it. I think in some of the more intense seasons of grief, it can feel like a tornado where all you have is an umbrella. And you just get battered around. But of course, the good news is grief also passes like a storm does, by which I don't mean that grief ever goes away. It's just more of a series of waves. And sometimes those waves are dozens of times a day and they just batter and beat you around and you're exhausted. And sometimes you get a season and you get a little relief before the next storm comes. Luke and I cover a number of human topics on this interview. It was one of my favorite interviews of the season. I think you're going to love it. And as we get in, I'm going to invite us to pause and just pray for someone that we know who might be grieving. If you know of somebody who's lost a loved one or lost something precious to them and they're struggling, Luke actually gets right in on the episode on what we can do as loved ones to help people. But just as we light our candle, who do you know that you could be praying for the peace of Christ that passes understanding? Let's jump in on the chat with Luke. All right, Luke, so you start the book I just laughed so much at this, talking about how it's obviously a fictional account. You're sitting at the restaurant with what turns out to be a diabolical friend. Mm-hmm. And there's a pitcher of water between you and your friend. You get up to take a phone call. You come back and your friend has put Quickcrete in the water, as friends are prone to do.
Yep.
You kind of replay the situation, like maybe they had pancake mix. It's this absurd idea that if you have a pitcher of water and you add something to that, is it still water? Tell us what you're getting at there.
Well, what I'm getting at is just how, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Good to see you, Steve. It's always an honor to talk with you. And I'm glad that you're a friend who would never do something as diabolical as adding Quickcrete to water if we were having lunch together. But the idea—
I'm even trying to picture them fitting it in their pocket, like just even functionally getting a bag of
One of my old
Quickcrete
workout partners was a concrete guy. And maybe that was in the back of the story. One time he's like, hey, Luke, I'm doing this side job on Saturday. I think it'd be fun. Let's come do this together. And maybe in the back of my head, I'm still traumatized from him thinking it would be fun for me to go do concrete work for a day in the summer in Texas. It's not fun. It's not fun at all. I'm not that tough. I can't do that work. But so imagine a friend, like say my friend whose name is also Luke, has all the concrete supplies in the world with him. And he put it in the water while we're trying to have a nice lunch. You would go, well, that's no longer water. And the idea of adding anything to water changes its substance. And what I'm trying to get at is this idea of conditional love is so normalized, despite the fact that it is ludicrous to add conditions to love. Anytime you add a condition to, I will love you, I will accept you, you will be mine, I will be yours. If you do this, it no longer is love any more than water with Quikrete in it, or water with pancake mix, or water with a little bit of lemon, a little bit of sugar. It's not water, because the second you add a substance to it, it's not the same entity anymore. And unfortunately, we are so normalized to the idea that love is contingent upon how we practice or how we obey or how we function, that we just think that's normal, even though it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I made a note when I was reading it. It really kind of stood me up. You then say that any condition added to love is no longer love. That's your point. Here's my question. Is unconditional love the only kind of love? We talk about all these different kinds of love. Are you making the case that there's actually only one kind of love and it's unconditional?
I think it's redundant, like the phrase, where is that at? That is a redundant phrase, because where implies at what location is someone. To say where is someone at is redundant. To say unconditional love, it's redundant, because love by its very nature doesn't require performance. It doesn't require conditions being met. So yes, I think the fact that we have to say unconditional love is because our understanding of what love is so devolved from what it's supposed to be.
Okay, so this brings up a lot of questions for me. It makes sense that a dog has unconditional love for a human.
Mm-hmm.
My dog seems to. Every time my dog sees me, he thinks that's the best thing in his life, is getting to see me.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing, Luke.
It is.
But I have heard you in the past maybe make not such the same kind comment about, for example, a cat.
Yeah.
So you do not unconditionally love cats. I don't think this is a big secret. I don't think there's any shame in bringing this up.
No.
What is your relationship with a cat? If it's not unconditional love, it's not hate. You don't hate cats, I don't think.
No. Here's my
indifference?
relationship to cats. If you type in my last name in cats, what you will find is a litany of textbooks written by my uncle, who is one of the foremost feline veterinarians in the country. He is a big dog in the cat industry, yes. 30 years ago, he and his partner split the practice. His partner took dogs, he took cats, because sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so feline medicine, my brother is in veterinarian pharmaceutical sales. He got in through my uncle. So my relationship with cats is very financially based. They help put food on the table for my uncle, for his kids, for my brother. Like it's family business. Dogs are amazing. They have unconditional love. Cats are different. But a relationship with an animal that I don't have affection for is just like, hey, it's, my neighbor has a cat, good on them. My in-laws have cats, good on them. But there's no love there. There's no, my dog is an idiot. His name's Oliver. He was abandoned when he was a puppy, so we got him as a rescue. He has serious problems. Anytime the front door is open, he will bolt out. He almost got ran over 8 days ago. I almost, with my very eye, he's like 11 now. People think he's a puppy. He is very disobedient, but I continue to love this dog, even though he is very misbehaved. That's what unconditional love, as we understand it, is. Like, my dog has serious problems, but I still have deep affections for him that don't wane despite his disobedience.
It's so funny, Luke. I mean, you're making this case, and when you say it, it's so obvious. But I got to confess, I've never thought about it quite so binary. I think, unconditional love is the correct kind of love. Then there's conditional love. We don't want that.
Yeah.
You're really putting your finger on it, saying, nope, it's either unconditional love or it's indifference. Or I suppose it's hate, or maybe there's other things too.
I mean, you can have, here's one of my hangups. Steve, I don't know if you're like a big American football fan, right? You are, right? Like your team, who's your team?
You bring up a sore topic. I grew up playing field hockey in Australia, which in Australia and the rest of the world is very manly.
My mom played field hockey. She loved
sport.
It.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's a women's sport in America. And it doesn't take much for me to be in the kitchen with my teenage daughter and all her friends, and I'll make a comment, and Kaylee, my daughter, would just say, yeah, but Dad, you played field hockey. So, yeah, it's well played. But yeah, I like American football.
Okay,
I can go there.
One of the things that any football team, whether it's collegiate, professional, even high school, they'll talk about the football team as a family. Hey, we're, the Dallas Cowboys, my beloved team. Hey, we're a family, we're a family. The problem is if you don't perform well, you're going to get cut and you're off the team. But we use this sort of familial language to describe how it is a very, it's a very contingent relationship. You perform, you're on the team. It's like any other workplace. Like if you do your job, people appreciate you, they're grateful for you. But the second you don't do your job, then you're no longer a part of the quote family, which means it's never been a family. Because family, you stay together even when people do things that are really unacceptable because you're blood, you stay together. And there is this sort of like interactions at a workplace where you do your part, I do my part. We can value each other. We can be supportive of each other. But at the end of the day, the relationship is predicated upon performance. And performance negates the ability for love to be there because love is not about performance.
I love this whole conversation. Several years ago on American Idol, when it first started, I remember watching, and Paula Abdul was seemingly quite inebriated on national television, live television.
Awesome.
And then the next night, she's surprisingly absent from the judges' table. There's just an empty chair where Paula Abdul would typically be.
Wow.
And there's Ryan Seacrest on the stage saying, Paula's taking some time off. Don't worry, we're all family. He used that phrase. And my first thought, and I'm not a cynical person, Luke, my first thought was, we may never see her on that again. Like, that's kind of the statement that they make as they're showing someone the door. And sure enough, she was gone within, I think, a few months of that incident.
Wow. But that's exactly the point. Like, family gets this sort of like, it's bastardized. Like, we've misused that word just like we've misused love to say, if someone does well at work, we're told, hey, let's show them some love for doing a great job. No, you're showing them congratulations. You're showing them gratitude. All these things are good. Like, there's nothing wrong with having a healthy relationship that has boundaries and objectives and expectations. That's normal. But that's not what love is.
Yeah. In the book, you actually flesh this out a bit more as we kind of move through your journey of integrating the life you have and the life you want, right? This is the heart of the book. You say your dad taught you a lesson between the difference between efficacy and worth. I thought that'd be really helpful for you to share that with us.
Yeah. Okay. So the story is, to stick with American football, this is years ago. I called my dad early in the morning. He goes, hey, why are you calling so early? This is not your normal routine. I tell him I haven't been sleeping great, which I think, many people understand that feeling of like something's bothering you so you don't get the sleep that you used to. And so he realizes that my dad is a clinical psychologist, a retired university professor in psychology. And so he says, well, what's going on? I'm like, Dad, can't we just talk about the Cowboys? Can't we just talk about something trivial? And my dad is not having any of that. And so he's like, no, what's going on? I'm like, all right, fine. And so I walk him through things in my head about some frustrations with these other relationships that are predicated upon work-based relationships, and certain things aren't getting done the way that I think they should be getting done. And so I finished kind of my rant, and he goes, well, Luke, it sounds like the theme of these stories is Luke isn't happy with the way someone else is performing. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. I have told stories and sermons that have less truth than that. So yes, that's probably accurate. And then he goes to explain that there's a difference of efficacy and worth. And it's easy to think that our value is predicated upon how efficient we are at doing the tasks that we think define who we are. And it's easy to start thinking that how efficient and effective I am at my work determines who I am and where my worth comes from. My dad is a person of deep faith. He's a Christian. And he says, Luke, a lot of people find their worth in a relationship or something else. I believe as a person of faith that it has to come from your relationship with God, which I agree with that as well. But it's so easy for us to kind of step into this idea that I am valuable, I am meaningful, I am worthy of acceptance because I do good things. I meet all the conditions that my employer has for me, or that my spouse has for me, or my kids have for me, and therefore I feel validated. Where it's kind of like walking out on a frozen pond. I grew up I was born in Philadelphia, lived in Ohio when I was a kid. Ohio, much colder climate than Texas, where I live right now. We had a pond in our front yard. In the wintertime, when we had a ton of snow and cold weather, the pond would freeze over. And when I was a kid, we loved to see just how frozen the pond was. And so we would step out And eventually we would start taking enough steps that we would move from the edge of the pond to the very center of the pond where it was deepest. And that's where it was most difficult for the ice to form thick enough for it to substantiate and sustain our weight. And in many ways, it's easy for us to take a few steps into trusting that our worth is predicated upon how efficient we are at our job. But the more steps that we take, the farther we get away from actually being grounded on something meaningful, and the more precarious we find our position. Because eventually there comes a time when you're not good enough, like you're not efficient enough. And that's when you're in a real tough spot.
Have you ever read the Catholic priest Herbert McCabe? Are you familiar with that name?
I don't know that name. Tell me about him.
He's kind of an obscure Catholic priest. I think he died like 20 years ago. I discovered him after he had passed away. He has blown my world up on this area because he says that the problem with sin is it infects our view of God's view of us.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah, it's amazing. He says we think that sin changes God's view of us, but what it changes is our view of God's view of us. And we no longer see God as who God is. We now see God as Satan, the accuser
that's good.
and the judge. I think that's what's coming to mind as I'm hearing you talk about this. He gives the example of the prodigal son. He's like, look, the younger son is in sin and distorts the view of God. The father, the older son, has a distorted view. Both see him as like a harsh taskmaster. He's like, the father never changed. Father always had unconditional love. And repentance, therefore, is God trying to convince us that God has always been God the whole time. It's really like a mind-blowing thing.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I mean, because the prodigal son thinks, well, I'll come back as a servant. And then the older brother says, Father, I've worked for you like a servant. Both of them
You owe me.
think like their relationship to God, the Father, is predicated upon working like a servant, like that they are, they're seen as hired hands. That's brilliant. Yeah, it changes not God's view of us, but how we view God's view of us. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
That's spot on.
That's it.
Yeah, and that gets to our efficiency, our worth, which is functionally, what I argue in the book is figuring out what is the core of our existence is one of the first demands that we all have to meet is like, what is the foundational relationship we have that defines who we are? And if it's always thinking that God's view of us is predicated upon how well we perform, like you're on thin ice. Like eventually that's going to crack.
Yeah. One of the dynamics you wrestle with in the book is just the idea of disappointment. And that means that if you're going to be a human being that loves the life you have, you're going to have to learn how to be acquainted with grief. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you and I both have had to bury our mothers. And so we are both acquainted, not just with grief in general, but some of the most personal grief with a beloved family member. As I was reading you really poignantly shared, that journey for you and your wife and your kids. And I just kept thinking, oh man, I know what this is like. Like Luke's mother dies. It's a colossal loss. He's having to do a lot of the work, and yet Sunday's coming. Mm-hmm. You still have to lead. Grief, there's no room in grief to pause your life and just grieve. It's more like the grief kind of joins your life and your work.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear what that was like for you to be leading and preaching while you were navigating that.
Yeah, it's not easy. And Steve, you know this just like I do, that it's painful because part of being a pastor is that you first and foremost are a person who needs pastoring, and you first and foremost are a human. And part of being human is that there are disappointments in life. Because in this world, as Jesus said, you will have trouble. And we all have these griefs that we all carry. And I think part of the reason we gravitate when someone tells a story of their loss is because in the particular, it becomes very universal. And we both lost moms in the last few years. And the particularities of me losing my mom different than your mom. Your mom didn't have Lyme disease. Your mom didn't have this chronic illness, and that, my mom, but you know the pain. And I think there is a grace that appears when we can be vulnerable enough to speak about the particularities of our own grief, because it humanizes and normalizes the way other people grieve, even if it's looks and feels a little bit different, because we all know what grief is. And so as a pastor, I find in the moments where I speak to that, there is a level of connection of those of us who've lost, and like that, it just appears, even if it's different. In terms of my particular grief and how my particular, in the words of C.S. Lewis, grief was observed, there was a weird mercy of my grief occurring during COVID, and which made the actual funeral process really difficult. Churches weren't open in Texas at that time. Had to call a friend up and say, hey, can I use your backyard for this funeral service? And friends couldn't be there. Church people couldn't be there. It was very different, and there's a loss that when you don't get to grieve in the normal way, like there's something that's missing from that. In a weird silver lining, it also gave me a little bit of space where I was able to grieve without having a bunch of people that I wasn't ready to be their pastor to while I was grieving. Like I kind of needed that space. And it just was a weird blessing of social distancing, is that I needed to be distant myself so that I could do some of that grief work. And in a weird way, I'm grateful for that. Not everyone gets that.
You had a really poignant story. I think it was, if I remember right in the book, it was the season within your mum dying. There was also some, as every pastor faces, some painful criticism in the church. I don't know any pastor that doesn't pastor a church where there's some group that just get their kicks out of kicking a pastor around. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of had this piling on, and you had a friend in the hospital, and you simply didn't have it in you to go.
Yeah.
And then it took a couple of days, and you described your care for your friend as meager. It was a great word you chose. And that the dynamic switched, and she expressed kindness to you. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful story. I find in my work with pastors, we feel like our job is to always provide care. It's so much harder for us to realize that our job is to provide a culture where everybody is cared for, including us.
Wow.
Like we are not responsible to provide all the care. We are responsible to provide a place where everyone receives and gives care. What's your reaction to that?
First of all, that's a brilliant line. Our job isn't to provide care, but create a culture where everyone is cared for. That's, I think all of us pastors need to write that one down. That's brilliant. That's exactly right. I find that there's far too many moments where I receive a sort of serendipity of being blessed in ways that you don't expect it. I used to watch Grey's Anatomy with my wife because I'm a good husband, or at least at that season of my life I was. And then she told me I had
to hear that.
I had to leave because I would laugh too much and give feedback. And so now she tells me to leave the room when she's watching her shows, which speaks to how maybe I'm not a great husband anymore. But one of the things that seem to be the normal plot is you have a medical professional who has a personal problem behind the scenes. They help a person with their medical problem, and somehow there is a life lesson that helps their personal problem behind the scenes. I'm like, okay, we get it. It's every time. It's, oh my gosh, he's alone. Wow. It's just every time. But that's my normal experience as a pastor, is that we do an exercise. I'm reaching behind me for those watching or listening online. Online, it's a podcast. What am I doing? So we have these cards. We call them Prayers of the People cards, which is a shout out to our more high church friends in the their liturgy. They have that phrase. But we write down on these cards a specific prayer based upon a prompt that we do each week. And I read through these. These are prayers. This is half of the stack from this past Sunday, where we talked about forgiveness. What do you need to extend forgiveness? What is the stronghold in your heart and I wept reading through these. Today's Thursday, Wednesday afternoon, I wept and read through them and was going, oh my goodness, these particular areas in which they're opening themselves up to the work of God's Spirit preach to me areas of my own heart. I read them, I was like, this is exactly the card that I should be praying, which is part of the power of the liturgy of going, we all need to share our prayers together because we testify to one another. And that's kind of the idea of this culture of care. And some of the serendipities of being a pastor is that there are moments like the one that you mentioned where, it's a meager phone call. It's not in person. I wasn't there in the room like I should be. I literally drove by the hospital. I was like, I just can't go in. I'm hurting too much personally. I just can't go in. And this person from my church just was so effusive with encouragement and kindness and mercy to me that like I literally was just crying while I was on the phone. And I was just so grateful that it wasn't like a call like this where you could see me, but it was just this amazing work of the Spirit in the community where people are being cared for. And I loved it.
Yeah. I find grief to be still one of these giant topics that people want to talk more about because in our culture, in Western culture, we just don't know what to do with death and grief.
Yeah.
And I've got one more question on grief, and then let's move off it. I really appreciate that you took time to say, here's what I wrote down. So many people don't know what to say or do when you encounter someone who you know is grieving. You, Luke, say to always acknowledge it. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on how do you help when you know a loved one is grieving a loss? What's the best move to make?
What's behind that is the notion that the person who has lost someone, and Steve, I love your perspective on this, like the person that you lost is always on your mind. Grief, and this isn't my metaphor, but my friend Beverly Ross says this, she's a therapist, she said, grief is like this brick. It's always there. You learn how to carry it, but it's not like it ever goes away. It's just part of your new reality. And so the reason that I would typically lean into acknowledging someone's grief is because it's there. It's not like you bringing it up all of a sudden makes me, oh, I forgot until you said this that my mom was no longer here. You're not bringing to the surface something I didn't know. Now, since I wrote that, I had an interaction with someone not from my church who, I tried to do this to them and they said, hey, I don't want to talk about that. I'm here at this part of my life and this isn't where I want to deal with that. All right, cool. Like I'll respect your boundaries and your space. And so some people don't want to talk about it, but to assume that the other person isn't already thinking about it probably is short-sighted. Does that make sense to you, Steve?
I love it. I'm on Team Luke on this. Like, I think there's so much anxiety when someone is grieving that you're so afraid of screwing up. I don't want to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I like your boldness in this, which of course, as you experienced, will always have exceptions. I like the idea of you saying, go ahead, and then let them tell you no. That's better than kind of tiptoeing around. I found it to be a good word. And I understand if somebody's in public or you don't know them very well, anytime somebody sees into us, we feel exposed. So I can see why someone would say, oh man, not now. But man, I really appreciate when I read that, I thought, wow, that's a good word for people.
Yeah. For me, I've appreciated when people say, hey, I'm sorry for your loss. For the first time, this is, 4 years after my mom passed, I was at a conference and someone who knew my mom 40 years ago said, oh, tell your mom hi. And then she was like, oh, wait. And I was like, cool, right on. But I was speaking a couple months ago at another church and someone came up and said, in between services, I literally am rushing to preach at a different campus. And someone came up to me and said, hey, I haven't seen you since you were a boy. I knew your parents and you lost your mom. I'm so sorry to hear that. And I told that story to one of my friends and they're like, oh, I can't believe he said that. And I was like, when I saw him, it was like, this is a person I know because of my mom. Like it's already on the tip of my brain. It's not like him saying that in a really rushed sort of like non-ideal time, discounted what I was already thinking.
Yeah. And as I think about it, I think the other guidance we can probably give people is I never get tired of stories about my mom.
Yeah.
Like if somebody were to just say to me, oh, sorry for your loss, it could feel a little rote. But if somebody were to say, oh, I'm really sorry, Steve, one of my favorite things about your mom, she was one of the wittiest people, I'd be like, yeah. And that I don't know, that's always, I think you can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I mean, that keeps the memory alive. And, as it's been said before, what is grief but love hanging on? And so these stories, there's the, what is it called? The Day of the Dead, where I don't fully understand the culture behind that from our friends south of the border here in Texas. But there's something about keeping the candle lit metaphorically about the loss of the person you love and telling the stories that keep them alive. And what do you want more than to hold on to those stories? Like it keeps it alive. That's beautiful.
Great. Okay, there's two more broad themes that, these aren't the only two left in the book. There's so many more, but one of them is disappointment. Obviously, grief is a subset of it, but you made this line that really stopped me in my tracks. You said, what's so disappointing about disappointments is their determination to spread. Disappointments don't ever stay in their original location.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a friend who works at Pepperdine University, which is in Southern California, and which Southern California is an area that's known for wildfires. And the first time I was ever on Pepperdine's beautiful campus in Southern California, th- there was like this weird smell in the air. And they're like, oh, yeah, there's a wildfire a couple miles away. And I was like, well, I guess we're all leaving. And they're like, no, we're all going to just hang out here. And I'm like, I don't like wildfires. It's kind of not one of my things. Like, I don't want to be burnt alive. That's just one of the unique things about me as a person. And I came to find out that Pepperdine is a campus that's uniquely designed. There was a terrible fire years ago. Everywhere in Southern California evacuated except Pepperdine. It was the only place in Malibu that stayed because the campus is set up where when wildfires come through, there's rocks, there's concrete, there's asphalt, there's like desert sort of like terrain on unique parts of the beautiful campus that prevent it from spreading all through campus. And the more I got to figure out how it was built and all that was behind that, I realized there's a metaphor for the way that disappointments work, that it wants to be like this wildfire that spreads through everything. And if you don't have ways to partition your heart, the grief that you carry, the disappointments that you experience, the bitterness that wants to reside in your, it will take over everything. And we see this, like where someone has a terrible experience with, okay, a guy dated a girl, the girl, broke his heart, and then all of a sudden the guy thinks all women are like this. You're like, no, it was one woman who's like this. Or you have a bad experience at church and you go, well, all churches or the entire church. And you're like, no, it's not the whole church. It was a couple people at church that hurt you. And it wasn't the church. It wasn't the entire religion of Christianity. But like wildfire that wants to spread, if there's no partitions, disappointments want to take over everything.
Speaking of that, you really got into this generalization tendency. I know as a pastor that you and I have a power that I don't think we feel, right? Like sometimes people experience us as very powerful, which means we can do damage. But I don't know many pastors like us that feel as powerful as people experience this. Does that make sense to you?
I could not agree. I could not agree stronger. That is 100% my experience.
I want to set that up and name that I believe church abuse is real, and I believe that when you're not aware of power, you can do damage intentionally or unintentionally as a pastor. And therefore, you and I as pastors have people come to our church and they say, the church has hurt me. The last church, maybe they left the previous church because the pastor hurt me or the church has hurt me. I'm guessing you've had many of those folks come to Westover Hills.
Yeah.
Have you ever had somebody come to you and say, I hurt the church?
You tweeted this like 2 years ago. You tweeted that idea and it has stayed with me forever. I've never heard anyone say that. I've never heard someone acknowledge that. I heard the church. It doesn't. Can I ask, like, you tweeted that. I couldn't agree more. What was your feedback after you shared that on social media?
Well, big pastor fans. I don't remember getting any pushback. I think what's tricky, Luke, is I do think there's maybe different kinds of pastors, and I think I just see myself as like a run-of-the-mill local pastor.
Yeah.
We don't have a big church. I don't have a particularly public platform with my pastoring. I do with my anxiety management ministry, but I guess there are pastors that have massive churches and kind of a global reach and therefore much more power.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't get any pushback. But my concern is somehow we have to acknowledge the genuine abuse that is unacceptable.
100%.
The spiritual abuse that happens sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. I'm pretty sure that I have done damage unintentionally to people because of the pressure I carry as a pastor to help people grow in Christ, if that makes sense. So I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
But I am concerned about how quick we are to look at our leaders as doing damage and not look in the mirror. I guess that's my concern.
Yeah, it seems that we see these over-the-top abusive stories from the people you describe with big platforms, and their reality is so removed from most of us normal pastors that to compare what they do vocationally to me would be as similar as saying, hey, the guy who's on the student board or the school board here at my local high school is the same thing as a politician who's the governor of Texas. You're like, they both have similar tasks that they oversee, but the actual scope and scale of what they do, it's so drastically different that probably is not fair to say that. But So we all acknowledge that there are pastors who have done some horrendous things. We know the stories. We've read the stories. We've seen the consequences of those stories. But to universalize that and go, well, that's like everyone.
All pastors are blank.
Yeah, I had someone who once came in and said, Luke, you're always just talking about celebrity pastors and your celebrity pastor friends. And I was like, who are you talking about? And you go, well, Chris Seidman and Rick Atchley. And most of your listeners probably aren't going to know those names. They're a big deal in my tradition, the Churches of Christ. And, Rick's church is 6,000 members. Chris is maybe 3,000 or 4,000, which that's not a small church, but that's not like a celebrity pastor. And so he, within days after, starts listening to the Mars Hill podcast that Mike Cosper, that he did such a great job with. The guy listens to that. A couple days later, he comes back and says, I was wrong about the celebrity pastor thing. And I was like, yeah, you were. You weren't even close to reality. Like, that's not, there is a thing as a celebrity pastor. That's not every pastor.
I bring it up. It could sound like two pastors talking about this as self-interest. That's not why I'm bringing this up. And I think you and I would both acknowledge, okay, we have these giant celebrity pastors. We also have these pastors of these little fiefdoms, of 100 people where that pastor is reigning supreme. Mm-hmm. Same dynamic, different size. The reason I bring it up is you're making a case in the book. It is not in your best interest to make generalizations. It's not a place of healing. So when you do say, the church hurt me, all pastors are blank, or, whatever the disappointment, that's actually keeping you bound because you're no longer seeing reality. I think that's why I wanted to push on this one a little more.
Yeah, no, that's great. Our mutual friend, Steve Carter, he talks about in his book, his experience at a mega church where it was a celebrity pastor, Bill Hybels, the conflict, the abuse there, which again, there's very serious abuse that happened there that needs to be discussed. And one of the things that Steve talks about is, first of all, the victims of that abuse are the main characters in the story that need to be supported. But he would also say that in his experience at Willow, it was easy for him to have a negative attitude about the entire church, but part of his ability to grieve, breathe, and receive, title of his book, to receive like this new grace was to acknowledge that there are 5 people at a church of 25,000 people, 5 people there hurt him. And that prevented him from burning down his relationship with the entire community. That's the value that I think all of us could hold to, is to go, hey, there might be 100 people in the room. They're not all the ones who hurt you. There are 3 people in the room that did things that were really detrimental to your well-being. Let's localize that so it doesn't become a wildfire.
It's so good. One of the dynamics you bring up, I think it's becoming more and more important for us to talk about, is loneliness. Yeah. You say if we want to live the life we have and love it, we have to grapple with loneliness. We are both becoming old. I think I'm ahead of you by about a decade. Man, as you get older, it just gets harder and harder to make friends. Why is that?
I'm sorry. We're getting old. Yeah, it's snuck up on me. My 3 daughters, the youngest one especially, are quick to point out how much gray I have in my beard, and now it's appearing on the side of my hair now. It's very difficult for some of us who've learned that we have to protect ourselves, that we have stuff to get done, that we have tasks that are most important, that we have places to be and things to accomplish, to prioritize relationships. And for some of us, you get to a certain stage of your life and you realize, oh, wow, I have over-indexed many areas of my life, but I haven't indexed community. And there are serious complications that happen from that. I would say I've got a lot of struggles. Male friendships probably aren't one of them, but what I do struggle with is learning to be vulnerable and to name some of the ways that I really have hurt, and I have anxiety, and I have mental health struggles, and I have grief. Like, it's hard for me to be vulnerable enough to name those, and I'm learning how to do that. And one of the things that I'm finding is that for me is something that I have to program in my head and go, Luke, if you want to love the life you already have, if you want to have peace, you can't just like read a Bible verse and memorize that and tell yourself 100 times, cast all your cares upon God, He cares. Like, that is a very valuable discipline. But if I don't verbalize the way that I feel the pull of negativity or the devil or evil or however you want to call it towards isolation and withdrawing and verbalize the way that I feel sin collapsing my heart, I'm not going to have peace. And so I might have a lot of friendships that I'm very grateful for, but I'm learning now how to lean upon them and to name some of the things that are actually happening inside of me that didn't come naturally to me. And maybe it comes naturally for some people, but I don't know if that's your experience, but it doesn't naturally come for me.
No, I'm the same way. I think particularly with men, I think if you get a group of men in a room, I think the two things that are hardest for us to say is, number one, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's why some boards get into trouble, is no one in that room can say, I don't know what to do here. And then the other one is either I'm hurt or you hurt me. I just think it's hard for a man to say to another man, I'm hurt or you're hurting me, and however that fleshes out. I had to go on a journey of friendship. It was about 15 years ago now, but it felt like dating. I was in my late 30s and I'm reaching out. I was newer to town, newer to a new city. And I just sit down with someone, have coffee. It's like, I'm kind of lonely. Are you lonely? Like, it really felt a little pitiful. And I'm glad I was vulnerable, because those are, to this day, some of my most precious friendships in my life.
I would say part of the reason I have that is because an older pastor said to me and a group of other guys when we were mid to late 20s, hey, you guys need to get together once a year. And because of the grace of a mentor investing in us, we have this group that's been meeting together every fall for almost 15 years at this point. But let me say, if I can be personal, you and I were talking last week, and before we started recording, you asked me how I was doing. And I kind of shared some stuff that was going on, and you and I are friends. I don't always call you up and say, hey, Steve, this is what's going on inside of my heart. And there's part of me that's going, Steve doesn't really care what's really going on with me, or, Steve wants to, let's just get to the stuff that we're doing. And I have to tell myself, no, Steve actually cares about me. Steve would gladly give X amount of time for me to share what's going on in my life in the same way I know I would do for you. And so I have to learn to tell myself, wait a minute, you're a pastor, you're used to people coming and talking to you. People would love to do the same thing for you. And for many of us pastors, we go, I'm the person who's supposed to be giving care to people. This goes back to your phrase earlier, not I'm a part of a community where people all need to receive care. And so it's hard for me to go, all right, I can be honest. I can share what's going on. I don't need to be the quote strong person. I don't need to be the quote pastor, but I'm a human being that for me to be human requires me to be connected to people in real ways.
It's so good. And, we're talking kind of pastor to pastor, but man, so many people deal with this, right? Like so many of my congregants, the way I would say it is we syncretize our anxiety with faith. And so our anxious responses sound like the gospel. Here would be one of mine, Luke. I help others. I never ask for help. That sounds a little bit like the Great Commission, but it's actually nothing like the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
But I have blamed Jesus for that worldview most of my life. I have said, I'm a pastor, I'm a follower of Jesus, I focus on others, I give and I give and I give. But really what's going on is I have a worldview that is counter to the gospel, which is don't ever be vulnerable, don't ask for help, don't put your hand up. And as much as you and I are pastors talking about this, I have so many other Christians I talk to that this is one of their big battles. They're always quick to sign up, they volunteer, they overextend, they pour out and pour out and pour out. And then some of them end up saying, where's everybody? Who's there for me? They kind of move into like a self-pity. And then others just kind of get burned out because they don't know how to receive care. I guess not just a pastoral issue. It's kind of a Christian issue, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a human issue. I think all the statistics of loneliness are through the roof, saying that men and women are more lonely now than ever before. Lauren, I want to say Santos, Yale psychologist, has done the research. I think I referenced it in the book, but like the rates are through the roof. I had a conversation with someone who, not connected to a church, friend of mine, really great dude. I knew he was going through some stuff, and so we eventually get together. We're sharing a meal, and he starts sharing what's going on inside of him. Like he's sharing the real struggles that are like near and dear to his heart, and they're real struggles, like all of us have. And then he pauses and he goes, Luke, I don't usually talk about this stuff with anyone. Do you have someone you talk to about this stuff? And that was heartbreaking for me. I deeply care about this person, but I also know that he's deeply isolated. And I think many of us across the board are deeply isolated. And from the beginning, God said it's not good for man to be alone. And it's not good for man or woman to be alone. Nothing has changed.
The book is How to Love the Life You Already Have, a guide to becoming the person life is demanding you be. Folks, it's a phenomenal book. I think I've read everything you've written, Luke, and Luke's a great author, a rare combination of like belly laugh funny and poignant and thoughtful. But listen, man, we've kicked some ideas around. We've tackled some broad themes. But as we consider what's coming next, I can feel, even through the screen, your hesitation. You live in Austin. You've digested Aaron Franklin's barbecue. You've possibly caught a music show at a festival. You may have even cursed the traffic when the Formula One comes through town. But, well, and I should also add, you've probably sung to a shape note, but you have not yet endured the gauntlet of anxiety on the Being Human podcast. So
Yes.
Brace yourself like a man. We've got 5 questions.
Okay.
These are short, kind of rapid fire.
Okay.
Here we go. Number 1, what sort of leadership situations are guaranteed to generate anxiety for you?
Job review. That's anxiety inducing.
Because why?
Because someone's trying to tell you what you do wrong. Like that's not ideal. I would say also, someone says, "Hey, let's get a coffee." And you say, "Well, cool. Yeah, that's great. What do you want to talk about?" And they say, "Oh, we'll talk about it when we get there."
We need to meet.
Yeah. No, we'll just talk about it when we get. That's anxiety inducing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What is guaranteed to generate a belly laugh in Lindsay, your wife?
Falling down. If
you falling down.
Yes. Yeah. Basically anyone falling down, she will laugh about. My daughters, if they fall down, I know that I scoop up, pick them up, and shield my wife from them. My neonatal ICU nurse wife, who will help and take care of anything, she cannot resist laughing when someone falls down.
Man, we're married to a similar woman. When I was early married, we'd moved our dining table and I'd walked into the chandelier and hit my head. And you know when you hit your head, it kind of makes you angry right away?
Yes.
So Lisa came over to comfort me. She's holding me and she starts shaking. And it's because she's like trying to stifle her laughter. So that's fascinating that both our wives enjoy other people's demise for their own pleasure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Who in your life is someone who you can be exactly yourself while at the same time wanting to be the best version of yourself? Who comes to mind?
I'm very grateful that there's probably a list of handful of people that come right to my mind. Jason Adam Miller, pastor in South Bend, Indiana. Josh Graves, Josh Ross, both pastors in Tennessee. Chris Seaman, Rick Atchley. Steve Carter is one of those people, our mutual friend. I'm leaving people out, but Jonathan Storment, Wade Hodges. I don't have a lot of things right in my life. I have a lot of great male friendships that mean the world to me. And there's obviously a lot of women in my life as well too. But yeah, I'm very grateful for those people.
Okay. When you're feeling completely playful and free, what are you doing?
Goofing around with my kids. That's one of my favorite things to do. I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's kind of my hobby. If you look, this little shiner I've got right here, it's the towards the end of it. That is one of my favorite things in the world to do as well.
Is to receive black eyes. You just enjoy being punched or kicked.
It was an elbow, but yeah. No, I love the sport. It's such a beautiful sport where you're fully present. Your mind has to be dialed in where you are for the most part. And mind and body integrated together. I just love it.
Great. Would you be willing to tell us about a recent mistake you made and how you recovered from it?
I got a call a few months ago from someone who I knew as their pastor when I was much younger. I just want to leave it ambiguous like that. And this person, in an act of bravery, told me something about their childhood that was really awful that happened to him. And this person told that to me on a Sunday morning when I was extremely busy. There's a lot of stuff on my plate at the moment. And 15 years ago, I did not stop and make space and fully understand what this person said. And this person carried resentment towards me for good reason, because he trusted me with something and I didn't fully understand what I was being trusted with. And I found out about it because he called and told me. And I was deeply grateful for the way that he gave me an opportunity to express how contrite I was and heartbroken I was for being a villain in his story, which I deserved to be in that role. So that's a mistake.
That's profound. I appreciate you sharing it. Last question is, when in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
I don't often tangibly hear the voice of God. I don't tangibly feel like the divine guidance of God's hand on my shoulder a lot. But our friend Kurt Thompson talks about you have to feel the love of God in your chest. I feel love in a very pronounced way, being a father and being a husband in my home. And I think that is probably the venue which I've most recently felt the pronounced love of God in as tangible as a way as any.
My guest has been Luke Norsworthy. He's the pastor or the minister at Westover Hills Church of Christ, Austin, Texas. Great state of Texas. Almost as great a state as Western Australia. You can fit 3.3 Texases in Western Australia, I wish to point out. However, Luke is the author of a brand new book, and it's a cracking book, How to Love the Life You Already Have, a guide to becoming the person life is demanding you be. I've had the great privilege of seeing Luke, pastor, up close. He is on my list of some of America's fantastic pastors. Luke, thanks so much for joining us on Being Human.
Steve, it's my pleasure. Always great to see you. Thank you, sir.